Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final lecture in this long series over the last 4 years that we've given on aspects of vision, eyesight. And one of the things that struck me during these lectures was how much I'd relied on images of art for the last 5,000 years to illustrate various points. And during these 4 years, I became acutely aware that there's a whole subject on how blind people are portrayed in art. And so I labelled the lecture the Iconography of Blindness to get it passed by the academic board. But actually, what iconography is, it's just merely writing with pictures, is what it literally means. So using pictures to convey a message, particularly in earlier periods, is very helpful for people who were illiterate or semi-literate. It wasn't just to illustrate the gorgeous manuals and the Bibles. They also had a function in explaining the story and the narrative. Now, images of blind people are extraordinarily common. They're much more common in olden days than they are today. And you'll see at the end of the handout, when you pick it up on the way out, that I suggest a couple of reasons why that might be. And at the end of this lecture, I'll try and put some of those concepts to you, but essentially we are living in bad times. We're living in times where if you don't have a perfect body and a perfect face, you're considered to be abnormal. And the only images that we see are of trite, beautiful, young, normal-looking people. And by normal, what I mean is that anybody who doesn't fit that body dysmorphic feature that we regard as being a beautiful human is not imaged, and we don't see them on the back of buses advertising whatever. We don't see these people in theatre, in the cinema. So in a way, disability and blindness has been whitewashed out of our society to a great extent compared to that extent in the past, as I'll illustrate and show you in this lecture. In ancient times, it was very common to have blind people portrayed as musicians or as poets, as pilgrims, beggars. There were images of punishment blinding to warn people what the punishments were for serious transgressions. And there were also the stories in the Bible of punishment blindings from God, religious blindings, to warn people what would happen if they strayed from faith. And the corroboration of that was the miraculous cures. Looking at this period from a medical point of view is not sufficient. The medical model doesn't help us understand blindness in the medieval world. It actually doesn't help us really understand it in the modern world either, I've become to understand. Look at this image here. It's a beautiful image. We've seen it before, and it's an illustration of cataract surgery, and it's in a surgical manual. It's about as useful as a teaching tool to teach someone how to do cataract surgery as as this. It's of no use whatsoever. It is a gorgeous image. It doesn't even tell us how cataract surgery was even done in those days, which was sitting down, with the doctor facing the patient also sitting down or kneeling. So in order to understand blindness, particularly in the medieval period, we need to have a religious model of blindness and what the meaning of blindness meant. Unfortunately, we have very little information from the blind themselves. We have John Audley mentions his own blindness. Gilles de Mussy, he praises cataract surgery, as many patients do today. And John of Luxembourg, the heroic blind knight who died at Cressy. There's a dichotomy of words that I just want to mention here. We talk about impairment. Impairment is the sight malfunction. Disability is what the social circumstances make out of that malfunction. Being blind does not necessarily have to be disabling. We as society choose to make that disabling. And I will show many examples in this lecture of where blind people lead full, amazing lives to show you what I mean by this concept. So during this lecture, we're going to look at some ancient depictions. We'll then deal with the medieval period and their concepts. We'll look at the Bible and the biblical inspiration for these images, and particularly for healing the blind. We'll talk a little bit about penal blinding, and then we'll finish off with some modern images. So, How do we represent blindness? How is blindness represented in pictures? And if it is represented, how will we, as the observers of these images, understand what is meant? So, obviously, we can look at the eyes, and they can be closed. They could also be closed because the person is thinking or sleeping, of course. But closed eyes could be a clue. Whitened eyes, such as in this image here, is a very good clue that there's something wrong with that eye, because the human viewing of a face immediately goes to the eyes. We first look at the eyes, we then scan the rest of the face, then we go back to the eyes. The eyes are critically important in facial recognition, so we're very hardwired to look at eyes and pick up abnormalities in eyes. Hollow orbits, which could represent enophthalmos or phthisis. This is either the extreme shrinkage of the eye, particularly from diseases such as tuberculosis or abscesses, or what might happen after punishment blinding. It could be asymmetry of the eyes, or the direction of gaze, which might indicate that this lady was blind despite having this big label that might help you out if you weren't subtle enough to pick up the clues. But they didn't often hang labels around them, particularly in the medieval period. So here we have someone who is blind, and there's a number of suggestions in this image of why he's blind, from his eyes and carrying a stick. And here he is throwing the stick away with his head upheld and his arms around, praising God that he has been cured from blindness. Often these medieval paintings are in the form of a cartoon, where we have an image separated in time in the same place. Now, it's not just the eyes. We've got the stance of the patient, of the person. Arms upheld could mean the person is visually impaired. There could be an unsteady gait, the patient walking with a stick, or there could be a bedridden figure. Watch out for people who are not doing anything in an image, where everyone else is busy. Look at them closely. Quite often they're representations of blind people. And this is how we can identify them when we look at medieval manuscripts to find these images. We can also look for some of the props. I've mentioned the cane. They might have a musical instrument. They could be led by a guide, including a dog. So seeing eye dogs are a very old invention indeed. They could also use a child, as in this image here of Belisarius with his guide, who unfortunately has just been bitten by a snake and is about to die. And there's the snake wrapped around this child's ankle, leaving Belisarius pathetically on his own in this world in which he has been blinded. Modern images would use dark glasses, and you can see this iconography is the same today. Stick, dog, glasses, they weren't present because they hadn't been invented at this period, as we know. Also blindfolds. And blindfolds indicating temporary or permanent blindness are used in very, very old images indeed. Of course, the oldest images of blind and sight-impaired people goes back to Egypt, and as we've mentioned in previous lectures, Egypt was known as the land of the blind, because blindness is very common there due to trachoma. It was very common in the whole of the ancient Near East. One of the most oldest images is from the Old Kingdom, and this is the 5th dynasty, and this patient is shown very clearly with a mature cataract. This is done deliberately because they knew how to make beautiful, realistic, three-dimensional looking eyes out of rock crystal, painted with a background, and this ability to do this was lost after the Old Kingdom, and even today it would be extremely difficult for us to make such realistic looking eyes. And these would bring to life, literally, a statue, this so realistic. Because they lost the skill after the Old Kingdom, there were different ways of representing blindness, and this is a terracotta and stone statue that's been painted, and again, deliberately indicating something wrong with this eye in this beautiful image. But more than that, there were many, many images in the tombs, and as far back as 1768, James Bruce discovered the tomb of Ramesses III, on which was this image of someone who is clearly blind, who is a harpist. It turns out that images like this are surprisingly common, and they occur throughout all of the dynasties. Here is a blind harpist represented by a slit for the iris. Here's another blind harpist playing to the king. And later on, there were also images of blind harpists in Nineveh and other areas of the Near East. So musicians and blindness has a very, very, very long association. But we have to be careful. Not all images of people playing harps with their eyes closed necessarily represents blindness. This is Alcaeus, the great songwriter and poet, who is reciting to Sappho, who some people believe they became lovers. He certainly was not blind. This gorgeous painting by Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema, who had this particular ability to paint marble as if it was alive and realistic, was actually considered by Ruskin to be the worst painter of the 19th century, and his images were about worthy enough to adorn Bourbon boxes. And so he was consigned to obscurity, having been damned by the greatest art critic of the century. But luckily he was rediscovered, and I discovered him as a young child in Manchester, where as a 7-year-old I was enraptured by an image that I've never forgotten. And so do look out for Sir Lawrence. He has come back into fashion, mainly because of his technical ability to reveal these flat paintings and to make them appear to be very realistic with beautiful textures. But nevertheless, in ancient Greece, we have some evidence of blindness. In Homer's poem, he describes the blind poet Demodocus in the court of the Phaeacian king in his stories of Troy. The muse stripped of sight, but gave the man the power of stirring rapturous song. From that, some people believed that Homer himself was blind, and this was a self-portrait. And certainly very, very old images of Homer in the antique style of statues show him in this fashion with his eyes closed, lips slightly apart. He's usually wearing a little headband here of bronze. This is the kalos geron, the beautiful old man type of image. And there are many, many examples of this image, which are all copies essentially, perhaps of an older bronze. And there was a description of this head as a bronze in the baths in Constantinople as late as 500 AD. There was a fantastic exhibition in Basel in 2008 where all the various images of Homer were collected, and there was a very good manual that went with this exhibition. It is in German, but it can be easily translated by several people who are sitting on the front row as well, and also other people around easily if you are interested in this subject. The style of portraying Homer changes. In the Hellenistic period, after Alexander had conquered most of the known world, they had a lot of influences in their art from the Far East. These images from the Far East changed the way statues were made and also how paintings were done. We now have Homer painted, still has the antique hair, still has the unruly beard, still has the headband, and in fact, there are statements that if it has a headband, this means it's Homer. This isn't true. This is a charioteer who also has a headband. So again, we have to be careful interpreting what is meant here. But this has been interpreted as the blind type Homer. And we're meant to look at these eyes and say, obviously, they're blind. You know, he's got the furrowed brow. He's got half-hooded eyes. Well, have a look around at you, at the person next to you. Does he have a furrowed brow or half-hooded eyes? I'm not quite sure that's an acceptable explanation, although we do know that this style of statue was present in the old libraries, particularly in the Hellenistic towns, and there are 25 surviving copies. Not only were they copied into the Roman period, this is a Roman copy, this is a Roman copy, we don't have a good original, but look at this. This is Romanesque art, the time of 1140 from Saint-Denis. the church of the burial of most of the French kings that was unfortunately looted and destroyed in the French Revolution. Look at this image. It's the same iconography. But this prophet may or may not have been a blind prophet. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because these images were not like this. This is the bust that's present in the British Museum, and I think is probably one of the best of the whole bunch. There were other depictions of Homer later on, slightly different, often used on bronze coins, because the original images of Homer may not necessarily have depicted a blind man. And this is the apotheosis of Homer, the making him into an exalted person. And the reason we can't be sure what's going on here is that all of these statues were painted. This is what we see in the British Museum. This is an overlay of what I think it might have looked like at the time. And this is our friend Lawrence Alma Tadema, who showed in his image what he thought it might have been like, with Phidias actually displaying to a friend, just before they've taken the scaffolding off the Parthenon, of what the actual sculptures and bas-reliefs might have looked like fully painted. So we look at Greek sculpture with this beautiful marble, either Naxos, the best, or Parian, or Pentelic, which actually changes this beautiful honey colour because it contains iron and oxidizes with time. We think that's what the statues look like, as very much we think this is what cathedrals look like when we go into a Northern European cathedral and see these beautiful vast spaces of stone. This is not what they used to look like. Furthermore, they were not only painted, they had a load of stuff on them as well. They might have had a bronze helmet. They could have been carrying extra stuff as well. So let's look at one of these antique portraits. This is actually Plato. He's not blind, but he's got these eyes. He doesn't have a furrowed brow, I do admit, but he's got the same eyes. So how do we know, if we didn't know this was Plato, that he wasn't blind? We can paint him blind, if you like. So to actually look just at an old statue that's been buried in the ground and has nothing remaining of its original coloration, it's a very difficult step to be sure that that is definitively an image of a blind person. Now, sometimes these sculptures weren't buried in the ground, they were actually in tombs. And here's one from Roman Egypt that's now in the museum at Houston. And the guard very kindly let me take a quick picture of it when the backs of the curators were turned. And you can see how gorgeously painted this was, in very realistic and caustic colours. And this wasn't new. This is Bronze Age statue from the Roman period, again, highly coloured. And this is in the Capitoline Hill and the museum there. So we're looking at a different world than what we now see remaining from it. Do we have any other evidence this was painted? Yes, we do. We actually have an image on this vase of encaustic painting of a statue. And here is the wax being melted with the pigment, with the sticks being handed over to the artist in this wonderful crater, which is a vessel for mixing water. Now, as I pointed before, many of the original statues were probably bronze and probably bronze cast. This, again, was from a special exhibition in the Capitoline about 3 years ago. And just look how beautiful this bronze casting is. He doesn't have any eyes, because these, or something like this, would have been his eyes, with ghastly eyelashes and some sort of image of the eyes within them. It wasn't really until we get to the Hadrianic period of the Roman Empire when people started making an attempt to sculpt into the eyes, which then makes it much easier for us to determine whether people were blind or not. And obviously Constantine, and this is the colossal statue of Constantine, obviously was not blind. His foot, which is in the courtyard, is about this big. So we can imagine how enormous this statue would have been. So although this looks pretty crude close up, at a distance and mounted on a pedestal or on a high place, would have been pretty imposing. Plus, it may well have been painted. But nevertheless, it's come through the years that Homer was blind. In the ancient times, some people say that he was blind. Some people make no mention of the fact he was blind. Some people suggest, since he has a dense poetic discussion of colours, that it's unlikely that he was blind. But used as a contemplation, we regard Homer's blindness not as a disability. It's considered as a mark of wiseness or even of spiritual richness, not as a disability. And this is quite a different way than we've looked on blindness for the last 300 to 400 years, which very much colours how we look on not just blindness, but all disabilities today. And I'm going to suggest that maybe we need to start rethinking this. It's a very, very common image to use of Homer. Here Homer is reciting his poems to the crowds in a glade. There were other people who were wise who were blind. Turayus, who unfortunately trod on a couple of copulating snakes and was therefore blinded. Being blind, he was asked to intercede between an argument between Zeus and his goddess wife Hera over who was having the more pleasure in sex, whether it was a man or a woman. Zeus said the woman, and Hera, being female, contrary, said it was the man. So they consulted Turayus, who'd had life as both sexes, both as a man and a woman, and he sided with Zeus. And this angered Hera, and the second version of the story is this is why he was struck blind. Zeus could not undo this wish of the god, of a fellow god, so he gave him another gift, and that he gave him the gift of prophecy, or in fact augury, which is the ability to interpret the will of gods by studying the flight of birds. And he's able to listen to birds and to the birds' chatter. Turayus was consulted by several people in Sophocles' drama Oedipus the King, which has the shocking story of Oedipus unwittingly being married to his mother. And Thebes is struck by the plague, so he goes to see Turayus and asks him, says, could you tell me why the town Thebes is struck by the plague? Initially, Turayus refuses to tell him why, because he says, it is but sorrow to be wise when wisdom profits not. Eventually, Oedipus pushes him too far, and in anger, Turayus tells him and says, the reason you've got the plague is because you're living in sin, and your wife is your mother, and your children are related more closely to you than just being your children. Appalled, he goes back. He confronts his wife and his mother and takes the 2 pins out of her chiton. Now, this is slightly more dramatic than you might imagine, because that's the only thing that holds the dress on. The dress falls to the floor. He looks on his mother and his lover, who's the same person, for one last time, and stabs the brooch pins into both his eyes, instantaneously blinding him. And you see him here bloodied, being taken out by his daughter as they are exiled. Very, very powerful image of blindness. Very powerful image of a metaphorical image of blindness as well. Orion, another person who was blinded. This time he was the giant who went to work for King Oenopion, and he fell out with Oenopion, who wouldn't let him marry his daughter, but he had carnal knowledge of the daughter anyway, and for that reason was blinded and exiled from the island. And here he is, with his little guide on his back, going to the far ends of the world to see Helios, the sun, where he was eventually healed. In the medieval period, blindness was a common feature for several reasons. Blind people were essential to society, as were disabled people, because of the need for charity and giving charity, which enabled people to come to a state of grace. And since they were living in what they believed was the last few decades or even years of the entire world, they needed to move on fairly quickly to get to heaven. And by giving charity and giving alms, this was one way of achieving remission of your sins and getting into the right place. It also encouraged the begging and the alms, and you would go through a crowd of blind people and various beggars and deformities to get into any church where there was a reliquary or by the town gates. So blindness was more complicated than just a consequence of sin. It could be portrayed as a divine gift, allowing insight, prophecy, or even musical talent, as we previously discussed. In medical treatises, they thought of blindness as an impairment that was in need of a cure, and cataract surgery was certainly performed in these times, not always successfully, as we'll see later. And then, of course, this metaphorical association of blindness with spiritual blindness, or perhaps not being a Christian, perhaps being a Jew or a Muslim, it could be a deeply racist thing as well in this period. Now, in this period, common things were closed eyes, having a begging bowl, wearing rags or loques, and poverty, and abject postures. These are the common iconographies of the early medieval period. We also have images of people with hoods and sticks and being led. Here is his leading person with bread wrapped up for their food later on, obviously just being picked up from begging. Again, the church, very, very important. Here's a blind person being led with a child, again in travelling attire, very, very common. Many of these beggars were itinerant. Because they were itinerant, they're about to become very unpopular. But not all blind people were unpopular. This is John of Luxembourg in Bohemia, who was blinded in his right eye by a French physician from Montpellier who performed appalling cataract surgery on him. The surgeon was put in a sack and thrown into the river, and that was the end of him. An Arab surgeon came in, but on this occasion managed to get a free pass and operated on the left eye with exactly the same result. So John of Bohemia, King of Bohemia, known as Jean l'Aveugle, the John the Blind, goes to Montpellier to see the great surgeons of the day, who very wisely suggests he has a diet and abstains from alcohol. If he was to do this, then it was fairly neutral for the surgeons involved, who realised that he had a ferocious temper when medical legal issues came his way. Now, whilst he's in France, there is something going on called the 100 Years' War, a Battle of Crécy, where John's son, as a subservient lord of the King of France, is fighting. So John of Luxembourg goes up with his knights. They tie all their stirrups together. He then says, "Where is my son, the Lord John?" He said, "He is there, sire, fighting the English. Lead me to him, so I will strike one mighty blow with my sword." And he does. And they charge down, where they're all found dead, tied up together the next morning, having been slain by the English archers. Now, that's unusual, but we have a heroic image of blindness here. And we're going to see this in various other stories of blind people being heroes. But back in the real world, where we're not kings and knights and we're just normal people, blind people have many roles. We know they're travelling poets, we know they're musicians, we know they're beggars. And beggars start to be divided into the deserving and the undeserving poor around this time at the beginning of the 14th century, which is after Europe has been involved in long wars. It's economically exhausted, it's emotionally exhausted, it's financially bankrupt because of the Black Death. At this stage, when you have been working your guts out and you've barely got a sou in your pocket and you see rich beggars hanging around outside the church, you're going to have exactly the same kind of response to them as unemployed people outside an office in Liverpool might have to rather rich immigrants coming in from other parts of the world. And it's interesting how these parallels in human nature continue to this very day. So one of the things you can do is you can make fun of them. Remember Fawlty Towers, where the waiter was from Barcelona. Well, what's so funny about that now? As people in Barcelona are saying, we have to forgive them, they are actually from England, or even worse, from Liverpool, or perhaps even London. So you could make them a figure of fun. Some of the images are difficult to determine who and who isn't blind here, but this person's definitely blind because they've got the dog, and the dog has the begging bowl. And often the dog would carry the begging bowl for the blind beggar. Several instances of poets and so on that we know about who are blind and payments. Unfortunately, they don't tell us much about their own blindness. They just mention it in passing. This suspicion of begging and blindness led to a suspicion even of blind singers. And there were stories of immoral blind singers and beggars in the late 13th century. And William Langland's Piers Plowman has an allegorical figure of hunger who has miraculous cures for beggars feigning blindness when the Black Death renders begging useless. So in fact, if you're very hungry and you need to work, your blindness can be temporary and you can go and seek finances another way that's not begging. In order to sort out who were good and bad beggars, local beggars could be marked by badges, and perhaps the most famous example of this is the fleur-de-lis marked for those who were in Louis' blind hospital, the Quinze Vingts in Paris. And it was a rare thing to be able to wear this image. It meant you were marked by the king and had special begging rights because of that. We talk a lot about Welsh harps. Perhaps the most famous of the Welsh harpists here was John Parry, and this is a portrait of him by his son. And he's playing the new fangled instrument, which is the triple-wired Welsh harp, which had been inspired by the arpa doppia, the double harp of Italy. And Welsh harps became very, very popular instruments still today. And playing them became a certain speciality of blind people, as with other instruments. However, here we see a blind musician fighting off his sighted opponent by holding up his hurdy-gurdy as he brings his knife out to stab him, to great merriment and laughter for the various people on either side, while this old woman is praying that everything is going to turn out all right. Beautifully painted image by Georges de la Tour with amazing dealings of the cloth, of the faces, of the rotting teeth. I mean, it's such an amazing image. You really do feel that you could actually be there. Blind fiddlers travelling with dogs, eyes closed. Fairly straightforward to interpret this. Less straightforward for the fiddler behind, but look at this. He's being led as well. So the dog is leading the blind, and here is someone collecting alms for the poor blind beggars. And we have a tradition continuing of blind fiddlers in this country as well, and this lovely image by Sir David Wilkie. He's slightly sentimental, but what's interesting about it is the only people paying interest are the children. Even the dog doesn't care less. And this one is mimicking him playing it by playing the bellows from the fire, taking humour and fun out of this poor blind man's imposition. And the blind as a source of ridicule, in fact, has a very, very long history. If we look down here, we recognise these people as blind. They're wearing the shaded hat, they're wearing the travelling clothes, and they're being led. And in fact, this turns out to be a real story. A chronicler in 1425 describes an entertainment where blind people were led out with drums and flags flying into a field where there was a large pig, and they were set about to start beating the pig, but they often beat each other more often than they beat the pig, which in medieval period was considered to be hilarious Sunday evening out. As well as just being sources of humour, blind people could be exploited. And there's a short play, Le Garçon de l'Aveugle, the boy and the blind man, where a blind man needs a guide and persuades the boy to take on the position. Now, the boy dislikes the blind. He says this in an aside earlier on, and he then disguises his voice in order to slap the blind man about incognito, steal his money and his clothes, and this humiliation of this blind beggar delights the audience. At this period now, blind people are being considered unworthy of alms. And here's a scene of someone surreptitiously stealing from the bowl of this blind man. We mentioned before about recognising blind people by using dogs, and in fact, the very old images. Here is a blind person with a stick. We think he's blind. The image is very, very degraded, but his posture suggests blindness. It's not a steady posture of someone who knows where he's going, with a dog looking slightly backward with pointed ears. We have images from ancient China as well of blind people with dogs, from a series of these images, beggars and street characters, very similar to medieval England of this period as well. And this beautiful painting of the Qing Ming, which means bright, This character here is the sun and the moon together, and this is thought to represent the festival, although it may not. It may just represent a scene of a day along the river. If we look in this Where's Wally, there is one image here of a man who has a dog, who's blind. And this is 5 meters long. So you can spend quite a long time missing out all the other delights of the palace if you spend too long on this picture. Several copies are made of this in later periods. It was a very, very important painting. We've seen this image before, but look again, the stick, the hat, the satchel, the travelling clothes. Even without the dog, we know that this guy is blind. Putting the dog in really just stamps it and emphasises it for us. And we see several images. Here's the dog not doing very much, and here he is carrying the beggar's bowl for him as he sets off on his journey. We've seen that before. We can see again here with his begging bowl, the broad brim hat. No one else has a broad brim hat. Okay, so broad brim hats to protect you from photophobia. Very good mark as well. Not uniquely to blindness, because they're also worn by people on long journeys. They're worn by pilgrims. But if you see it in the image where no one else is, you want to look more closely at this image. And we look and we see the eyes are actually painted closed. We don't see the iris in them. Okay, that's another clue that this guy's blind. He's begging. Often beggars had some sort of disability, because if you didn't, you weren't going to be a very successful beggar. And look at this, the little terrier as the blind dog. Even later medieval art, this beautiful German illustration of Prince Josaphat, which is actually the story of Buddha translated into a Christian context. And look at the position of the hand. It's a typical position for Buddha, and it's been adopted by this Christian picture. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the blind person who he's waving at. Now, why would Josaphat be waving at a blind person? Because he's never been outside the castle. He had no understanding of what blindness or the world was about. We know this guy's blind because his eyes are closed. He's got his stick. He's got his little dog, his little terrier dog leading him along. And if you're not led by a dog or a child, and the blind are led by the blind, unfortunate things can happen. And this is a very important allegory, and we're going to come back to it later on as they fall over each other in Peter Bruegel, the Elders painting. We actually know where this was painted now because this church has been identified. Again, the importance of being led. This is the Danse Macabre of Matthias Merian. Death cuts the cord. The dog is no longer leading, and he is now blind, left alone without a guide in the world. Many interesting aspects of that story, as you know. Now, blindness in the Old Testament became a rich source of images. And what I thought I would kick off was to show you one that's just around the corner. This is actually in the Guildhall and painted by George Manton in 1888. And it's the story of Jeroboam, who is the king of the northern 10 tribes of Israel. He had left God, and his son became sick. So he sent his wife in disguise to go and see Jeroboam, who was blind. And he sent her disguised, hoping that Jeroboam wouldn't recognize her, because he himself had forsaken the Lord. And he unfortunately gets the following message: I will bring disaster upon your dynasty and then destroy every one of your male descendants, slave and free alike, anywhere in Israel. I'll burn up your royal dynasty as one burns up trash till it's all gone. So that is not the message he wanted to hear. But even though he's blind, he was able to pass the message on to the king's wife. So eyesight could fail in old age, and it could make people wiser, able to have introspection, to think on things, to become prophets. There were examples of helplessness and exploitation, and in fact, being blind barred you from becoming a priest. The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And this is very important in later Byzantine and Anglo-Saxon kingship, where blind people were not allowed to access the throne. And of course, there's dozens of metaphors, meaning lack of understanding. If you have too many gifts, you blind the eyes of the discerning. This was a warning to judges, very relevant today. It's a message against corruption in the courts. And blindness also describes those who dwell in darkness or in prison or in captivity, and there's many, many examples of this. There's also examples of punishment, an eye for an eye, the Italian formula. There's not much evidence that this was actually performed in any frequency at all, although we've got several instances of people having been blinded as a punishment during war or afterwards, but also people could be blinded as a punishment inflicted by God. Here we have King Zedekiah, who's chained and he's brought before Nebuchadnezzar. We'll look at this image again later on. But remember I said one of the other ways of identifying people who are blind, who are not just bored and asleep because they can't understand the language that's going on here, as he's been transported there as a prisoner of war, is he's doing nothing. Everybody else here is animated. They're busy. They're doing things. The second thing is that someone's offering him food and he can't see it. He's not making any gesture himself to receive the food. One of the stories, there are many, but one of the ones that I think probably has the most interest for us, particularly so frequently illustrated, is the story of Tobit. And here is Jacob van Mierland, the greatest Flemish poet of the 13th century, illustrating his Bible, showing the son of Tobit anointing the eyes. He scraped the eyes with fish gall to cure his father's blindness. A couple of things here. Look at the dogs, very frequently. They're not in the Bible story, but they're present in nearly all of the medieval images. Next time you pop into a church, just look up. Any church will do. And you'll see beautiful, beautiful carvings. And these carvings tell a story. And all you need to tell the story is to understand the key. So here we have a crowned head, and here we have a crowned head. As we look along these images, this is a cartoon version of the story of Tobit. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a professional camera, so taking this picture wasn't helpful. So I thought what I'd do is go in a little bit closer and stand on a chair. And here we can see in a little bit more detail what's going on. Tobit is burying the corpse, the Jew who had died outside the gates, giving him a proper Jewish burial. Dung falls on his eyes and he is blinded. And here he is blind with an image of looking eyelessly up to heaven. He has a conference with his wife and they decide to send his son off on a mission, on a very, very long mission, very dangerous mission, where he's accompanied by an angel and also by his dog. And he meets someone, his son Tobias. He asks for permission to marry them. He's carrying in his bag the gall of a fish that he's caught, and he comes back, and here he is, that image of striking the eyes of his father with the gall and curing his father instantaneously of this blindness. Sometimes these images, I think, we may need to disagree with their current interpretations. This is an interpretation of Tobit with a Caladrius bird. I don't think this is the case. I think this is Tobit lying in bed, and remember what I said, it's one of the images, someone lying in bed on their own is sick, disabled, and sometimes blind. I think this is the bird that pooed in him and blinded him, because Caladrius birds are normally white, and they look back, gives the person a good prognosis. If the bird's looking this way, it's curtains. So image of a Caladrius bird is very, very important. They actually don't exist, although they're very, very common in medieval bestiaries. And again, look at this bird here. Again, said to be a Caladrius bird, but it's not white. It could be, but equally it could be an allusion to the reason why Tobit was blinded. Here he is being cured by his, this is actually the archangel Raphael. And here he is again by the painting of the Master of the Feathery Clouds. Look at these beautiful clouds in this beautiful image. Perhaps the most moving of painters of the post-Renaissance is Rembrandt. And look at his dealings, his quality of dealing with light. Remember that these pigments are only reflecting back about 30 times the difference between this pigment and this pigment in real life. But the way he puts these pigments together makes it look realistic, the 1,000 times brighter this light is. And this is the genius of Rembrandt, how he does light in this way. And we have Tobit, his wife, sitting contemplating quietly his blindness as his wife performs work to make money. And here is Tobit blindly kicking over the spindle that is used because he's not got any guide with him as he staggers around the house. This was thought to be a generic image. It's also in the National Gallery, but reappraisal, having looked at that previous image that I spoke to you about, Rembrandt, and knowing that that image is an image of someone who's blind, has led to this image being reinterpreted in more recent times, and we now believe this is yet another image of Tobit and Anna, and here is the bare cupboard, very, very similar. So very similar iconography can help us identify the subjects of paintings more accurately. It's a funny thing, isn't it? It's as Gary plays. And the more you know, the more you find out. And we can now start looking, and hopefully all of you may start looking at pictures and images in churches, and I know that story. It's come to me, and suddenly churches that are just a bunch of old stones suddenly wake up and start talking to us and become really, really important parts of our culture, whether or not we're religious. Isaac, tricked by Jacob. We know the story here where he pretends to be his hairy older brother who's been sent off. The blind father feels the hairy arm, which has been covered with the goat skin, and blesses the younger son. And this is quite a potent image that's used throughout several periods to illustrate this act of trickery. It also backfires in the next generations when the blind Jacob blesses the younger son Ephraim when they're in Egypt, and he deliberately crosses his hands, and again the older child is missed out. His wife is actually the princess of a very high-ranking royal family in Egypt. This is an interesting painting, actually, by Benjamin West, who was born in America and raised in America, came to England, and along with Copley, stayed in England despite the American Revolution, and in fact became a historical painter to George III, painting that wonderful picture of the Heights of Abraham. Lovely old Rembrandt. Look what he's done with the light this time. He's made the light look as if the blessed child has a halo. Extraordinary how he does this. Very, very few pigments used at all here. Gives it a very deep sense of reverence and religiosity. Healing of the blind led to many, many images, including this one by Tissot, who we discovered in an earlier lecture on tuberculosis. You may remember that he took on board the beautiful but jilted wife of the Indian army officer as his muse and put her into his house against local opposition, where she lived until she died. And that wonderful painting of her close to death that Tissot did, which I think touched all our hearts in that lecture. These images of curing the blind are very, very old. There are several stories in the Bible. Mark is one that came to Bethsaida. This is in his early ministry in Galilee, and this is Bethsaida today. Matthew has another story, and two blind men this time. And here's a very, very old image from the Byzantine period. If you want to see Byzantine art now, you don't go to Byzantium. You go to Italy. And the reason is because of what was called the iconoclasm, and there were two periods of iconoclasm where all the religious images were destroyed, but in some parts of the world they survived, and Ravenna is one of them. Very old Bible here, the Codex Egberti, two images of blindness here, very, very early prototype of Romanesque art. And this was one of the set texts that I had to study on my medieval art course at the V&A. So if anyone ever does that course, you will be familiar with these images. Again, depicting the classical stick, the beggarly pose. Early on, we've not got into the pilgrimages yet, because people aren't going on pilgrimage to cure themselves of blindness. Here's images of the two blind beggars again being healed. This is another Greek motif. This is the Cora mosaic. This is an old photograph of mine. I'm actually going to be rephotographing it again in this museum in 2 weeks' time. But look at this on the narthex. This beautiful, beautiful mosaic, these wonderful images, amazing thing of late Byzantine art in the 1300s. Again, very important image. And in fact, the washing of the eyes after the healing of the man born blind, this story is in Mark, it's almost a set piece. It's not exactly the same. There's a bit of a change in the mountains here, instead of having a city, but essentially the iconography is the same. And it's passed on rather like the images of Homer that we saw that were passed on for hundreds of years, the same exact way of portraying him, until there's a complete shift, a paradigm shift in the Hellenistic period. And these images persist and are very similar to the images that we see in earlier illuminated manuscripts. But also we see similar images in the Eastern Empire, and particularly in the Armenian tradition. And these are the images from the Gladzor Gospels, and this is where they were made, and there's 4 painters have been identified who make these images. Again, we see Christ with his halo, and one of the interesting things we'll notice about Christ is at his background he has gold, and the laity, the blind, have a normal background of a city. And here are the 2 beggars again with their canes, eyes closed, travel satchels. Very common image we're going to see again and again. A different image this time of a different curing of blindness. Again, Christ with his gold background, reinforcing his godliness. And here is a disciple who's gone out to lead the blind man to Christ. This is Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus was thought to be Bar Timeo, the son of Timaeus. But there is also Aramaic roots to this word that could mean he's the son of a sinner, implying that blindness was due to hereditary sin, which is one of the important things that Jesus actually says here, is that there is no sin. This man has not sinned. And again, Armenian drawings as well as paintings. Absolutely gorgeous images, perhaps the famous, well, my favourite really are the Limburg brothers. I mean, nobody paints like this. This is just so beautiful whenever you see it. It makes you want to fall over. And this is the person who's blind and demented, and here's the dementor, the devil, being taken out and leaving through his head, and he's opening his eyes, and vision has been restored by Christ. This image is in the National Gallery, the famous one of Duccio. A lot of people don't like it because everything's a bit green. Originally it wasn't green. Green is the underpainting. On top of this were put other pigments that have faded with time that gave a very realistic flesh tone. So underpainting and building up of this tone. This is a very, very important time in art because this is when we're changing from that standardized Byzantine period into early Gothic art. And what we're doing is, the only bit that's left of Byzantine now is this is the gold background, so it's not all gold, which it is in Byzantine art. We're starting to bring a little bit more realism into the buildings. They're not now flat. There is some attempt at some type of perspective and depth in here. And this is one of the earliest examples of this period. Let's look how this might work in the same person at the same time. Here is Dominekos, who is working in Crete, and this is an icon painting. It's a classical tradition that's nearly 1,000 years old at this time. It's the last painting he did before he comes here, which is to Venice. And this is the church that was built, and this was the largest Greek colony outside Greece. And you can actually go down this canal, and this is one of my own images. It's an absolutely beautiful part of Venice, very peaceful. It's where the artists lived. And he paints this. He's gone from this to this. Now, this is heavily Venetian in style, both in the use of colour, but in the use of perspective and also in the use of ancient buildings to portray this drama of this story. And the most beautiful example, his last attempt at this, is in this painting of the healing of the blind, which is in the Metropolitan. It's not finished here. Here is El Greco himself looking on, and what he's done is to tighten up this composition and get rid of all the litter that was in front, as you can see here in the Venice one. You know, the dog's gone, the bin's gone. This group is now more tightly put together and separated just slightly, giving more space to the image and more drama to it. And this is actually a masterpiece of painting. Then he moves to Rome, and after he goes to Rome, he goes to Spain, and he never revisits this topic again, having painted it at least 3 times.
Again, a very common image, and this is Poussin's version of it. I've just enlarged the relevant bit, showing the touching. Not all of Christ's healings were touching. Sometimes they were at a distance. But clearly, when he is touching the eye directly, we can get this impression of these people being blind. Many, many, many Baroque images of this. It was a very, very important topic during this period. And here is Tissot with a man bathing in the pool. I look at this image sometimes and I almost feel I need to wear sunglasses. You feel you're there. It's so bright, the light, the sunlight coming off the pool. You almost feel like you're getting a reflection, which is very difficult to portray when we are doing a slideshow. But even in a slideshow, I think you can understand what I'm saying about this. I trained in Manchester for a while, and here was this wonderful image of Christ healing the blind man. It's in terracotta, and this is no longer the eye hospital, it's now moved. And in Seattle at the ARVO meeting last year, I was astonished to see on Seattle Cathedral, again, this image. So this is an image that is alive and kicking today, and a very, very important image. It's not just about the healing of sight and how to have physical disabilities cured by faith, which is a very medieval view. It's also reflected metaphorically in how we can have our own religious blindness healed through Christ and belief and faith. And this is what these images are really about. We've got to be careful when we read the books because it's not always correct, as was pointed out by Dorothy Glass in her beautiful book, Reading Medieval Images. This classically was thought to be the story of the healing of the blind, the entry into Lazarus, and the entry into Jerusalem, okay, which are scenes that occur together in the Bible. In fact, it's not. In this box, that is not someone who is blind. What it is, it's touching a blind person. What it is, it's a teacher. And here is another image from Chartres showing the teacher who is beating the child. Not curing them of blindness, beating them. And that's what teachers did. And why would this teacher be represented here beating a child? Well, this is Sant Cassiano, who was actually put to death by his children, his pupils, sticking him with their pens, their styli, which is not to be recommended in getting your own back on unpopular teachers. But nevertheless, it did lead to his martyrdom in the name of this church. So this is not an image of blindness, so be careful interpreting these old images. We've given a lecture in the past, not directly related to this Gresham series, on medieval hospices, and many of these were for the blind, specifically for the blind, and this is one that still exists today, which was for the blind priests, the Hospital of St Mary in Ripon. Not only religious people could cure blindness in the Byzantine world. You could have Roman doctors, or mainly Greek slaves, curing them. And this, I just noticed it as I was walking down. These are the steps. I thought, oh my goodness, this is actually the sarcophagus of an eye doctor. And here he is in this religious pose. Very, very ancient image of blindness and treatment and healing of blindness. So apart from doctors, we've got no Jesus now. Could other people do it? Well, people becoming saints could. And this is quite common. Saint-Remy is one of the first, where it is predicted that he's going to be born and he's going to use his mother's milk to heal the blindness of the hermit who's been spoken to. And this gorgeous, beautiful image, this beautiful stained glass, again in Chartres. There used to be wonderful stained glass in Saint-Denis as well, but again it was mostly destroyed. Some fragments of it are in the medieval museum called the Cluny Museum, confusingly, in Paris, if you are interested in this period. And you should be, because it's the most beautiful period in blue glass. In fact, it's the most beautiful period of art that there ever was and ever will be. And here's another saint. We met him in the last lecture. This is one of the reasons he was canonized. This is San Diego, who San Diego in California is named after. And here he is, healing the blind. He also had a clockwork model of him, and he cured Prince Carlos. This window is one of the most important windows in the entire world. It's one of the largest windows of stained glass still existing from this period, and this is the St. William window in York, and amongst it shows one of William's miracles, which is the healing of the blind woman. This was one of his other miracles, which was the collapse on the bridge when he came back to York after having been deposed as the archbishop, and then he was reappointed when the archbishop who deposed him died. He was involved in these terrible family squabbles at that period with King Stephen. He himself was a very controversial and probably unpleasant man, but nevertheless it didn't stop him going on to become canonized for, amongst many things, saving the drowning and curing the blind. St. Bernard, of course, cures the blind. Here, look at these children in their travelling clothes with the hat. Okay, rather a rich one, this one, hardly beggar's clothes. Look at this, it's another red with the hat. Attached to the hat is a little shell, suggesting that he's been to Santiago de Compostela, but there isn't a powerful enough saint for curing blindness in Santiago, so he has to come to this shrine where this particular saint has been known to have the powers to cure blindness, and with this belief in it, he is given a little present here, he goes up and he's cured of blindness. So if you weren't cured of blindness, it meant either the saint wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't holy enough, or you didn't have enough faith yourself. This is a very late image by Sandro Botticelli when he's starting to get into this abstract style. And it's very easy just to overlook. It's a busy, busy picture. But hang on, have a look over here. Here we are, healing the blind. Here's a blind person going along, being healed at the tomb, because Saint Elizabeth, even when they were dead, these saints had as much power as when they were alive, and they could carry on curing people. In fact, these cures can be shown. This is the same lady in this cartoon pattern that I showed you, where she's wearing the green hairnet, okay? She's blind. These are the barber surgeons and the oculists, can't do anything for her. She's led or pushed away by this lady to go to the church, and here she is, hallelujah, hand raised up. She can see the mass being raised. Now this is a very, very important image, because raising the mass in the Catholic Church in the medieval period allowed everybody to see the host at that miraculous moment where the bread was turned literally into the flesh of Christ, as so they believed. And it was very important to be able to see that. And St. Anthony as well. Now, deliberate blinding, we will go through very early images of this, of the blinding of the Cyclops by the Polyphemus painter, used throughout. And when religious imagery alone is not sufficient, and people in the Renaissance start looking at other stories, they start looking at the ancient myth and start painting images of blinding and blindness from those stories as well. You blinded with a red hot end that you held on a stick, looking like a corkscrew, and you screwed it into the eye, as has happened here. And this was Bernard, king of the Lombards, who rose in revolt against Louis the Pious. This was the period when France, Italy, and Spain were being divided at the end of the Ottonian Empire. And there were all these he was left out of what he should have had. So he rebelled, gave up the rebellion, went on his own to Louis, and Louis still had him blinded and all his things, and his relatives were put into a monastery. The Byzantines were also pretty good at blinding people. Once blinded, you can't become the king. So it's not just a random horrible punishment, although it was pretty horrible. It was done deliberately to stop people becoming king. Again, and this is the reason why it was done here on this king we've mentioned before. Actually done even in England. Alfred, the brother of Edward, who was later to be Edward the Confessor, was blinded by hot pokers on the orders of Earl Godwin, which probably explained why Edward the Confessor hated the Godwin family and why the successor was nominated by Edward the Confessor as being the Norman dukes, because he did not want the Godwins inheriting the throne of England. Now, as we know, Harold was the last English king, and he took the throne by force against William, and eventually dies in 1066. Now,
We know that blinding is on the rolls because William I introduces it from Normandy whilst we're in this period. But we can look at the heirs' rolls, and these have been studied in some detail, and I've read the accounts of these studies, and they show that the actual enactment of blinding was in fact very, very rare. This is a beautiful image of Burnes-Jones of Friederswald, who actually was attempted to be raped, but took sanctuary in the monastery and was able to avoid that particular problem. The king himself, Algar, who tried to rape her, as he walks into the church, is rendered instantaneously blind, which is a religious form of punishment. Look at this image here. This is the eyes of Samson being taken out, and this is one of the panels in Sainte-Chapelle. A very sort of disturbing image, really, isn't it? Here's one from England. This is the blinding of Aylward, who's also incidentally being castrated at the same time, which was his punishment, which was meted out by the wandering magistrates after he failed. This is the Trinity window in which this particular roundel, it's just there, is, again, beautiful coloured glass. This is the magistrate, by the way, wearing the hat. Monreal, here we have some Romanesque images of blinding, and the blinding of Samson is very common. This image is probably the most disturbing. We actually see Rembrandt himself here shying away in horror, as might he do so, as this eye is physically gouged out with a spurting of the arterial blood, bringing home precisely to everybody what this punishment meant. So you were very careful in these times about performing acts of treachery and so on. And here we have images of this instrument that was used to literally gouge the eyes out. And here's another image, the martyrdom of Saint-Léger here. And also here, again, on the martyrs. I couldn't get this very well. You can see it's very, very bright. It's about midday and I've got a train to catch, so I can't wait till 4 o'clock and get it. But essentially, we know who these people are. This is the gridiron, so we know this is St. Lawrence. This is St. Vincent, who's been washed ashore. Here's the waves. And then this is St. Léger, who's here having this instrument ground into his eyes. Blindness also has a movement from unbelief to belief. Beautiful image by one of the greatest, Fra Angelico. Commonly done, here's Tintoretto, with his beautiful colours, typical of the Venetian school. St. Paul down here, this enormous, busy image. A little bit more personal here with a shying horse that's frightened from Parmigianone. And then, of course, Caravaggio's image with a typical foreshortening, arms upstretched, a very dramatic image here. Had been used by Cranach, Bellini earlier on, and of course even Michelangelo has a go at this. So a very, very important image to do. Also, the Coleridge of this story is, of course, Ananias restores the site of St. Paul, and here is a wonderful, beautiful Baroque painting showing this in the Acts of the story in the Acts of the Apostles. Sometimes, himself, people could be commanded to be blind by God. And this is a painting from one of the Raphael cartoons, which then, because he was struck blind, the proconsul of Cyprus converts to Christianity. So he himself wasn't made blind, someone else was made blind instead, and that was enough for the proconsul to convert. Wise chap if this sort of stuff is going on, especially with these guys around who can make people go blind. Now, this is the Raphael cartoons. I haven't got time to talk about them too much, but they were a great great work of art, and they were going to be hung in the Sistine Chapel beneath the wonderful ceiling. Now, Michelangelo had been working in secret. Nobody knew what this ceiling was going to be, but Raphael managed to trick his way in via a cousin of Raphael's called Bramante, who was the architect of the building, and what he saw astonished him. So he immediately was working on a painting down the road in another church and changed it.
Michelangelo saw this and accused him of plagiarism. And they fell out and permanently became enemies for the rest of their lives. But it's true. Nevertheless, it didn't stop Raphael producing one of the most amazing series of cartoons and subsequent tapestries and images that were used by generations of artists for hundreds of years afterwards. Belisarius was blinded in a fit of jealousy. Here he is, the emperor. There is Belisarius, his senior general, fit of jealousy. This story is embellished in Paris and produced as an allegory of the evilness of kings, and led to a series of paintings where the blinded Belisarius is now outside the Pincian Gate in Rome, begging for alms in his former helmet, which is being handed out. He's recognised by one of his former officers, who cannot believe this, as his weeping family hang around him. And this led at this time of the French Revolution to a number of very moving images. And this is the Stouff image. Now, I don't have any question that this person is blind, not just sleeping. But you see in this image, it's quite different from those ancient Greek and Hellenistic images of blindness. There's really no mistaking this Belisarius is in agony with his blindness. And many, many images are produced, again, using the iconography of the helmet. Probably the most famous one is this one, which is Dati Obolum Belisario, give a penny to Belisarius, which was lampooned by Franklin as this is Britannia, who is being dismembered and is preventing the freedom of the colonies. And a beautiful bronze by Chaudet, again, coming now into the period where we're getting a little bit more romantic and sentimental. And these images, of course, by Gerard, very, very sentimental. Here's the snake, here is the dying child who used to be his guide, and here's Belisarius himself with his stick, about to set off in the world on his own. I'm going to pull this to a close. We're talking about allegorical blindness and blind foals, which have been used. Beautiful drawing here. Look how this red chalk has been handled. And in fact, there is no contour lines drawn here at all. It's all just done with the image of indentation. But justice is meant to be blind. There's a thought for you. But only recently, older images of justice weren't blind. And in fact, this is the first blind justice here in Bern. Comes from the thrones, the types of angels who were delivering justice and intermediaries between God and lower orders of angels, and subsequently us. And this is a beautiful bit of English stained glass in St. Lawrence in Harpley. And used by George Frederick Watts, this similar type of imagery in this very romantic fashion. We've discussed this painting before about war and blindness, and there's a series of images of war and blindness that I'm not going to go into in detail with you because we have a whole lecture on this, including one of the most astonishing paintings of the last century, which may not necessarily be based on Bruegel's Blind Leading the Blind, because we have drawings when he was visiting here with his fellow surgeons of sketches that he was doing at the time, which actually show all this going on. So it's quite likely this was a real event. But nevertheless, it's very potent, the blind leading the blind, and these images have been used over and over and over again. And the sentimental versions I'll leave you to look at yourselves. I don't really think they need much in explanation. This is an interesting one because you can just about see he painted the rainbow the wrong way around the first time. This was pointed out to him, so he had to take it back and repaint it. But you can actually see where he has repainted it because the rainbow inverts its colours, which he didn't do. And then finally, the modern sort of images of blind people as they're tucked away, out of sight, no longer part of our daily lives on a daily basis. And maybe we want to think about that and think how we view disability. Perhaps any of you listen to In Touch, perhaps on a Tuesday night on Radio 4, I think it's about 9 o'clock usually when I'm coming home from work. And then to realise exactly the difference between impairment and disability. And I'd like you to go away with that thought as we've gone through a 4,500-year trawl of images of blindness. Hopefully you've enjoyed some of them, which have been gorgeous. Hopefully you've been appalled at some of them, which
depict the most horrible thing imaginable, which is to lose your eyesight. And I also hope that you will now, when you wander around churches or art galleries or your daily life, you may be aware of blindness and the impact that it has on these people's lives. So thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you very much indeed for the whole series of these lectures. And they're all online, and there will be a handout for this lecture outside if you wish for some more information. Thank you.